In a small village nestled between green hills and winding rivers, there lived a young girl named Ayesha. The village was peaceful, with simple houses made of clay and wood, and a cool breeze always whispering through the trees. Life in this village moved at its own quiet pace, and though Ayesha couldn't see any of it, she could feel it in the vibrations of the earth beneath her feet, the sounds of the birds chirping, and the warmth of her mother's hand. Ayesha was blind from birth, but her world was no less vivid for it. Her senses were sharp. She knew every stone in the ground, every creak of the floorboards, and the exact time the sun would begin to set by the sound of the wind in the trees. Her mother, Sarah, was her anchor in this world. Ayesha didn't remember much of her life before she could walk, but she always remembered her mother's comforting voice, the smell of her cooking, and the soft touch of her hands brushing through her hair. Sarah was the person Ayesha trusted more than anything. Her mother worked tirelessly to make their lives better, taking up jobs in the village, whether it was working at the bakery or cleaning houses for the wealthier families. Despite their struggles, Sarah always managed to keep a warm home, filled with love. Ayesha grew up knowing she was safe with her mother, even though their world was far from perfect. But their happiness wasn't without its complications. Imran, Ayesha's father, had been a different man. Ayesha could tell, even in her limited way, that he was the type of man who had loved her mother deeply when they were first married. Sarah would tell her stories of their early years together, how they had laughed and dreamed of a bright future. But those dreams faded, swallowed by the darkness of Imran's addiction to drugs. As the years went by, he had changed. The man who had once promised to love Sarah for the rest of their lives had become a stranger. His addiction ruled him. He would come home late at night, his hands trembling and his mind distant, leaving Sarah to carry the weight of their family's survival alone. Ayesha was too young to understand what addiction was, but she could feel the change in their home. The warmth her father once brought had vanished, replaced by cold silence and sharp words. Sarah tried to protect Ayesha from the worst of it, but there were nights when Ayesha would hear her mother crying, her soft sobs echoing through the house. Ayesha would lie in her bed, unable to do anything except listen. She didn't understand why her father wasn't coming home, why he wouldn't laugh with them anymore, or why the house felt so tense. She didn't know how to fix it, but she could feel the sadness around her. Then, one day, Imran left. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a heated argument or a confrontation. One day, he simply wasn't there. Sarah never spoke about it, but Ayesha could feel the shift in the air. The house felt empty without him, and for the first time, Ayesha realized how much of her world had been shaped by his presence. Even though he hadn't been a good father, the absence of him was still a profound change. For Sarah, it was the end of an era, and though she never showed it, Ayesha knew how much it hurt her mother. There were days when Sarah looked as if she had aged years in a matter of weeks. She was alone now, both as a mother and a woman. But, true to her nature, Sarah didn't let that sadness break her. She worked harder than ever, often leaving Ayesha at home, while she worked late into the night to pay the bills, buy food, and keep the house running. Ayesha began to notice the tiredness in her mother's voice and the dark circles under her eyes. But Sarah kept going, determined to give Ayesha the best life she could, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. Despite the pain of Imran's departure, life continued in its own way. Ayesha began to grow older, and as she did, she noticed more and more the gaps in her life. Children at school would talk about their fathers, how their dads would walk them to class, play games with them, or bring them treats. Ayesha had none of that. She didn't even know what it felt like to have a father. Her only father figure was the one who had been distant, cruel, and eventually gone. Still, she never questioned her mother. She knew Sarah was doing her best. As Ayesha reached her teenage years, she could sense the changes in her mother, too. Sarah started to smile less and less, and her eyes would wander, as if she were lost in thoughts of what could have been. And then, one day, Sarah met a man named Faisal. He was kind-hearted and gentle and showed a sincere interest in Sarah's life. Faisal was a local carpenter, and he often stopped by the market where Sarah worked. He struck up conversations with her, asking how she was doing and listening patiently as she spoke about her struggles. At first, Ayesha didn't know what to make of Faisal. He was kind, yes, but he was also new, and Ayesha was protective of her mother. She didn't trust him, not yet, but slowly, as the days passed, Faisal began to earn her mother's trust. He showed Sarah how much he cared, offering help with things around the house and always asking if she needed anything. He even spent time with Ayesha, bringing her little gifts, reading her Braille books, and talking to her like an equal. One evening, after months of seeing Faisal and Sarah grow closer, Ayesha overheard a conversation between them. It was soft, but she could hear the love in her mother's voice as she spoke to him. "I never thought I'd find someone like you again," Sarah had said. "You've made me believe in love again." Ayesha's heart sank. She didn't know if she was ready for her mother to love someone else. She didn't know what it would mean for her life, for the life they had together. But she also knew that her mother deserved happiness, and so, though she didn't fully understand it, she supported her. Sarah and Faisal got married soon after, in a small ceremony. It wasn't anything grand, but it was a beautiful moment for Sarah. Ayesha stood by her mother's side, clutching her hand tightly, both happy and uncertain. It was hard for Ayesha to accept this change, but she knew she had to try. She was learning to trust Faisal, but something about him still made her uneasy. The months that followed were a mix of joy and discomfort. At first, everything seemed to fall into place. Faisal was a kind stepfather, always offering to help Ayesha with her Braille lessons, spending time with her in the garden, and making sure she felt included. But as the weeks turned into months, Ayesha began to notice things about Faisal that made her feel uncomfortable. He would linger too long when speaking to her. His touch would become more frequent, and sometimes, when they were alone, she could sense that his gaze lingered a little too long. Ayesha didn't understand what was happening. She didn't have the words for it, but her instincts told her something was wrong. Every time she was alone with Faisal, her heart would race. She would feel trapped, unable to escape from his gaze or the way he spoke to her. Her body would tense up whenever he got too close. One evening, when Sarah was working late at the bakery, Ayesha found herself alone with Faisal. He came into the living room, where she was sitting on the couch reading a Braille book, and sat beside her. Ayesha felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't know how to react. Faisal began to speak softly, his voice smooth and almost coaxing. "Ayesha, I think you're growing up so fast," he said, his tone too gentle. "I see how beautiful you've become." Ayesha's heart began to race. Something wasn't right. She tried to pull away, but he placed his hand on her shoulder, gently but firmly. "I don't want to talk right now, Faisal," Ayesha said, trying to keep her voice steady, but Faisal ignored her. He inched closer, his hand now resting on her arm. The air around her felt suffocating, and Ayesha's instincts screamed at her to get away. But before she could do anything, he leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. Ayesha didn't know what to do. Panic took over her body, and before she could think, she ran. She bolted from the house, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath ragged. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the village, where a small shelter for women and children stood. She knocked desperately on the door, and the kind woman inside let her in without hesitation. The shelter became Ayesha's haven. It was there that she began to rebuild herself, to trust again, and to understand that she was more than just the daughter of a broken home. Here, she began to learn Braille, and through therapy, she started to heal. As the weeks passed, she knew what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to help other women and children who had faced the same darkness she had. Ayesha began taking small steps toward a brighter future. She attended support groups, met other survivors, and found solace in their shared stories. Slowly but surely, she found the courage to speak out about what had happened to her. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way to free herself from the nightmare she had lived. Meanwhile, Sarah had begun to suspect something was wrong. She hadn't seen Ayesha in days, and her absence felt like a hollow ache. When Ayesha finally returned, her eyes filled with sorrow, and Sarah asked her what had happened. With trembling hands and a breaking voice, Ayesha finally told her mother everything about Faisal's behavior. Sarah's heart shattered, but she believed her daughter, and for the first time, she saw the full depth of what Ayesha had been enduring. She immediately called the authorities, and Faisal was arrested. Though the pain of the betrayal was deep, it was also the start of something new. Ayesha, with the support of her mother, learnt to heal. Together, they found peace and strength, and with every step forward, Ayesha became more determined to help others find their own way out of the darkness. At the shelter, Ayesha met women who had survived abuse, women who had found their voices in the same way she had. She became a counselor there, using her experiences to guide others toward healing. As her confidence grew, so did her hope for a better future. She knew the road would be long, but she was no longer walking it alone. With her mother by her side, Ayesha knew that no matter what the future holds, she has the strength to face it. Together, they had found light in the darkness, and that light would never fade. In the months that followed Ayesha's escape from Faisal's advances, a transformation began to take place in both Ayesha and her mother. The shelter, though small and simple, became their refuge. Ayesha's days at the shelter were filled with learning and healing. She learned to trust herself again, to believe in her own strength, and to accept that it wasn't her fault. Every morning, she attended Braille classes, and in the afternoons, she helped organize activities for the other children in the shelter, teaching them how to read and write in Braille. Sarah, too, found solace in her work at the shelter. After years of fighting battles alone, she found a community of women who understood her. The women shared stories of resilience and survival, and it was in this safe space that Sarah's spirit slowly healed. She began to work part-time as a counselor, listening to women who had walked similar painful paths. Though the scars of her past were still there, the weight of loneliness and guilt lifted as she helped others find hope. One bright spring morning, as the sunlight filtered through the trees outside the shelter, Ayesha sat by the window, lost in thought. She had just finished reading a book in Braille, her fingers moving swiftly over the raised dots. It was a book about courage and survival, and Ayesha felt inspired by the stories it contained. She thought about the future, her future, a future she had never allowed herself to imagine before. Ayesha had once believed that her life would always be defined by her blindness, by her father's absence, and by the pain that seemed to follow her everywhere. But now, with each day that passed, Ayesha's sense of possibility grew stronger. She no longer viewed her blindness as something that limited her. Instead, it was part of who she was, and it had given her a unique perspective on the world. As Ayesha walked through the village one afternoon, holding Sarah's hand, she realized just how much had changed. The village, once a place of sadness for her, now felt full of potential. People greeted her with warm smiles, and she began to feel a sense of belonging. One day, while walking through the village square, Ayesha stopped in her tracks as she heard a familiar voice, a voice she had almost forgotten. "Is that you, Ayesha?" The voice was warm, kind, and filled with recognition. Ayesha turned toward the sound. It was the village baker, Mrs. Amin, who had been a friend of her mother's for years. Mrs. Amin had always treated Ayesha with kindness, and her presence filled Ayesha with a sense of comfort. "Ayesha, it's so good to see you," Mrs. Amin said, placing a gentle hand on Ayesha's shoulder. "I've heard so much about your work at the shelter. I'm so proud of you, my dear." Ayesha felt a rush of warmth in her chest. She had never realized how much her community had been watching, waiting, and supporting her all along. As the days passed, Ayesha continued to grow in confidence, and her bond with her mother strengthened. One evening, as they sat together in the small garden outside the shelter, Sarah looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with pride and love. "Ayesha," Sarah began softly, "you have become so strong. I've seen you change, and it fills my heart with hope." Ayesha smiled, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. "It's because of you, Mama. You never gave up on me, even when everything seemed impossible." Sarah took her daughter's hand and held it tightly, knowing that the road they had walked was long and painful, but they had come through it together. They had found their own path to healing, and now their future was full of light and hope. Together, they would continue to fight for others, just as they had fought for each other. The darkness that had once surrounded them had been pushed back, and the light of hope shone brightly on their future.